Say you're at a cookout when you notice that there's a giant spider hanging out on your friend's shoulder. You want to avoid total pandemonium. So you casually wave to get their attention, then make a brushing motion on your left shoulder. But instead of realizing that they're inches away from certain death, your friend thinks that you're busting out a new dance move, and the whole cookout starts breaking it down. Waving to say hello, yelping when you get hurt, or brushing at your shoulder to try to save your friend from mortal danger are all examples of nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is the process of sharing thoughts and ideas using behavior other than words. The gestures, movements, and facial expressions we use to share information with one another are all forms of this type of communication. It also includes things like smiling to show you're happy, or giving a thumbs up to say, okay. In other words, nonverbal communication is kind of like a game of charades, only you're playing it all the time, even if you don't realize it. In fact, around 65% of the meaning we get from communication comes from nonverbal signals. So understanding how nonverbal communication works can help you better express yourself and avoid being misunderstood. I'm Cassandra Ryder, and this is Study Hall, Intro to Human Communication. But nonverbal communication isn't a solo act. It's more like a duet. That's because our nonverbal and verbal communication work together as part of the same system. Verbal communication uses words to share ideas, and nonverbal communication uses gestures and sounds. It's like verbal communication is the melody, and nonverbal communication is the harmony. And when their powers combine, our messages become even more meaningful. For instance, we tend to rely on verbal communication to share complex ideas and express ourselves clearly. Like when someone asks us for directions, we use spoken or written words to explain which route they should take. Like turn left at the library, or it's the second door on your right. Because to help someone get from point A to point B, they need as much specific information as possible. And that's where verbal communication really shines. Nonverbal communication, on the other hand, adds extra context to the words that we use. So along with using words to give directions, we can also use our hands to point out which way someone should go. Nonverbal cues can also clear things up when our words might be misinterpreted. Like telling someone, go that way, would be confusing unless you also pointed to where you wanted them to go. We also use nonverbal communication to convey emotions and connect with others. For instance, you'd probably smile while giving directions so the other person knows that you're friendly and willing to help. And finally, nonverbal communication also helps us make judgments about a person's credibility or trustworthiness. Like someone who's lost might not ask you for help if you're looking around and have your arms crossed. In this case, you're broadcasting that you're probably waiting for someone and don't have time to answer a stranger's questions. So if nonverbal communication can do all of these things, does that make it more important than verbal communication? Well, it depends on the context. Like, verbal communication is probably more important when you're making a big business deal and want to make sure everyone's on the same page. But if you're disagreeing with a friend, paying attention to their tone of voice and body postures can clue you into how they're really feeling. And that's normal, because nonverbal and verbal messages play different roles in how we communicate. But they also have a few things in common. Like, both verbal and nonverbal communication include nonvocal and vocal elements. For instance, writing and American Sign Language are nonvocal elements of verbal communication because they both use symbols to make meaning, and you don't actually speak them with your voice. We also use nonvocal elements during nonverbal communication. According to the field of kinesics, which is the study of movement, there are three main types of nonvocal, nonverbal cues: gestures, facial expressions, and postures. Gestures are non-vocal and non-verbal because most gestures don't refer to a specific word like a written or signed symbol does. Like when you wave to your friend at the cookout, you could have been saying hello, goodbye, or trying to get their attention. Because there isn't one single word that we associate with waving, we have to use context clues, like facial expressions or spoken words, to understand what the wave really means. And while many gestures have more than one meaning, kinesics lets us sort them into different categories based on the type of information they're sharing. For instance, gestures that describe something are called illustrators. Illustrators are used to clarify or reinforce a verbal message. Like if you'd pointed at your friend's shoulder during the cookout and said, "There's a huge spider," they would know exactly what you're communicating. In this case, that they need to brush the spider off. And by using an illustrator to clarify your verbal message, you can save your friend and the cookout. Then there are emblems, or gestures that have a meaning that people in a community or culture have agreed upon. Common emblems include shaking your head to say no, or shrugging to show that you don't know something. In the cookout scenario, if your friend went to brush the spider off and asked if it was gone, you might use the emblem of nodding your head instead of saying yes. Or if they asked how many spiders were on their shoulder, you could hold up one finger, which would also be an emblem. Basically, emblems are super helpful because they give us a way to communicate clearly without using words at all. We can also use gestures called regulators to manage our conversations with others. Regulators keep the conversation flowing, like when we lean forward to show that we want someone to keep talking. But we can also use regulators to pause a conversation. Like if your friend is telling a wild story, but you really need to tell them about the spider on their shoulder, you might hold your hand out with your palm open to get them to pause. And in any scenario, regulators help us keep the conversation flowing and ensure everyone's voice is heard. Then there are adapters, which are gestures that help our bodies release tension during stressful situations, like twirling our hair or clicking a pen during a job interview. Adapters are different from the other types of gestures because we usually aren't aware that we're doing them. And while they make us feel better in a tough situation, adapters can actually distract the people we're communicating with. Like hair twirling during an interview totally steals the spotlight from your awesome story about how you saved your friend from a deadly spider bite. Because even when we don't realize it, our nonverbal cues still send messages to other people, even our subconscious hair twirling and pen clicking. But with a little self-awareness, we can recognize and monitor our adapters and project confidence in any situation. Illustrators, emblems, regulators, and adapters are important because they add meaning to what we say and even replace verbal communication when the moment is right. But gestures aren't the only non-vocal elements of nonverbal communication. We also use things like eye contact to create connections, share information, establish our credibility, and even make a good impression when meeting someone new. But eye contact can also be used to intimidate others. Like, we probably all remember disobeying the rules as a kid and getting the look from our parents. And when they made eye contact, oh man, you knew you were in big trouble and needed to clean your room right away. Eye contact also interacts with other nonverbal cues, like facial expressions, so we can better understand what people are thinking and feeling. For example, if you smile at a baby, they'll know you're friendly and might even smile back. Facial expressions, like smiles, are often viewed as innate emotional reactions to the world around us. Like, smiling at strangers in public might feel totally involuntary to you. But the truth is that all of our facial expressions, including smiles, are also social behaviors. In many cultures, we smile to make other people feel at ease. And because we wear those social smiles for the benefit of others, we view them differently than the genuine smiles we put on when we're feeling strong emotions, like joy or excitement. So like waving or giving the thumbs up, most facial expressions have different meanings depending on how we use them in different contexts. And the better we are at pairing facial expressions with our verbal communication, the more effective our messages can be. But there are also vocal elements of nonverbal communication. Yep, you heard that right. Some of the sounds we make count as nonverbal communication. I know. That's pretty confusing. But we often use sounds to add meaning to the words we speak, like when you raise your voice when you're angry or speak quickly when you're excited. Because these sounds aren't included in our grammar system, we call them paralanguage, which literally means alongside language. Paralanguage refers to the vocalized but nonverbal parts of a message, like pitch, volume, rate of speech, and verbal fillers. Like, if I start talking loud and really fast, you might think something exciting is about to happen. Once we learn how paralanguage works, we can use it to convey meaning and emotion in our conversations with others. For instance, in English, we use a rising pitch to indicate that we're asking a question, like this: is there a spider on my shoulder? And if we want to emphasize the intensity of a verbal message, we might increase the volume of our voice, like this: there's a giant spider on your shoulder. Vocal elements of nonverbal communication make our words more expressive, and they can even stand in for words when we need to express sudden feelings, like surprise or fright. Without these vocal cues, our verbal communication just wouldn't be as exciting. So if nonverbal communication is so important, how do we learn to do it? It's not like you take classes on when to use an illustrator versus an emblem in school. Instead, we learn how to use nonverbal communication by participating in our culture. Different cultures have unique norms or guidelines for how to use nonverbal cues. For example, pointing is fine if you're from the United States, but in China and Indonesia, it's considered really rude. Artifacts or objects and possessions we use are another form of nonverbal communication that's shaped by the culture we live in. Most cultures have rules about how we use artifacts, which include our clothes, jewelry, and the decorations we put up in our spaces. For example, on some college campuses, it's the norm for students to wear pajamas to class. There's a good chance no one told students that wearing fuzzy slippers to class is cool. They just saw older classmates doing it and assumed it was okay. But some cultures have explicit rules about how artifacts should be used, like wearing a wedding ring on your third finger on your left hand. And using artifacts to express ourselves can also be fun. Like, if you're a huge Lord of the Rings fan, you might slap a bumper sticker of the Ring of Power on the back of your car. But someone who hasn't seen Lord of the Rings might think your bumper sticker represents your passion for ancient jewelry. instead of your undying devotion to the fellowship. Navigating nonverbal communication can be a little confusing if you're not familiar with cultural rules and norms, but it's impossible to know all the nonverbal norms from every culture in the entire world. So it's inevitable that nonverbal messages are going to get mixed up sometimes. It's just a normal part of living in a world with so many amazing cultures and traditions. But just like we use context clues to figure out what unfamiliar words mean, we can also look for context clues to understand nonverbal communication. For instance, if you notice young people bowing to older people, you can infer that bowing is a sign of respect, and add that to your nonverbal vocabulary too. At the end of the day, we can't not communicate when it comes to nonverbal communication. Our nonverbal cues are a window into our feelings and emotions, and they're constantly seeping out of us, even if we don't realize it. So to make sure our nonverbal communication reflects what we truly want to say, we have to be extra thoughtful, because a single hand gesture can be the difference between squashing a giant spider and accidentally starting a dance party. Thanks for watching Study Hall, Intro to Human Communication, which is part of the Study Hall project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you liked this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU in the links in the description. See you next time!